Three men, 3 mornings in a row, standing at the fence of an elementary school in a town where nothing ever happens. And one little girl who noticed something the adults didn't. She said the man knew her name, said her dad sent him, but her dad never called her Mila. Never once in 8 years. By the time Ryder Knox found out, his hands were already shaking. Not from the cold, not from the freezing Ohio rain hammering his knuckles against the handlebars, but from something older, something he'd buried under 12 years of silence and scar tissue, and the particular kind of guilt that only men who failed to listen once carry forever. The black ravens were already rolling. And somewhere in the dark, a child's name was written in a stranger's notebook. Hey, if this story already has your heart in your throat, stay with it all the way to the end. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to know where in the world you are tonight. Let's go. The frost came early to Denton, Ohio that year. It arrived the way bad things often do in small towns, quietly, without announcement, settling into the gaps between things before anyone thought to look. By the second week of October, the cornfields along Route 9 had gone gray and brittle, the stalks snapping in the night wind with sounds like small bones breaking, and the fog that rolled off the Scioto tributary each morning was so thick and white that driving through it felt less like moving through air and more like moving through something that had already decided not to let you pass. Ryder Knox had been riding through that fog every morning for 3 years. He left the house at 6:45. Mila buckled into the sidecar he'd built himself the summer she turned 5. Welded the frame in his shop over 4 weekends, painted it flat black to match the Harley, bolted in a proper racing harness because he didn't trust anything that hadn't been tested 3 times with his own hands. The sidecar had a small windshield and a wool blanket he replaced every November. Mila called it the pod. She treated it the way other kids treated forts, like sovereign territory, like a place that belonged specifically to her in a world where most things belong to other people. The drive to Denton Elementary was 11 minutes. Ryder knew it down to the stoplight sequences, knew which stretch of Birch Avenue had the pothole that would rattle the sidecar frame, knew the crossing guard's name was Dennis, and that Dennis drank bad coffee from a thermos that had seen better days, and that Dennis would raise one hand in that half-wave that wasn't quite a greeting and wasn't quite a warning, but was somewhere in between. The town watched Ryder Knox the way towns watch anyone who doesn't fit neatly into the story they've been telling about themselves, with a kind of suspended judgment that was never quite neutral and never quite hostile, just permanently waiting for him to become the thing they already suspected he was. He was 34 years old. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw, a souvenir from a roadside device outside Kandahar that had taken the hearing in his left ear for 11 months and the easy sleep from every night since. He wore a leather cut over a gray thermal even in mild weather, the back patch of the black ravens, a bird mid-dive, wings folded, talons forward, visible to anyone who cared to look. Most of Denton cared to look. His shop, Knox Ironworks, sat on the edge of town on a lot that was half garage and half salvage yard, and the sound of metal and engines that came from it during daylight hours was the kind of sound that made certain neighbors call it an eyesore, and other neighbors call it reassuring, and which group you fell into said more about you than it said about the shop. He had full custody of Mila, had held it for 4 years since her mother, Carrie, had moved to Columbus and then to Phoenix, and then to a silence that stopped being communication and became something else entirely. Mila did not ask about her mother anymore. She had asked for a while, the way children ask about things that confuse them, with a kind of patient persistence that is more devastating than anger. And Ryder had answered the best he could, which was never quite good enough but was honest, and eventually the questions had settled into something quieter and harder that lived in the space behind her eyes when she thought he wasn't watching. He was always watching. That was the only thing he knew how to do well anymore. Pay attention to the thing that was right in front of him so he didn't lose it the way he'd lost everything that came before. She was 8 years old. She liked blackberry jam, but not strawberry. She could name every planet in order and several moons, which she had learned from a library book she'd checked out 4 times. She laughed at things he didn't always understand and went quiet in ways he'd learned to respect. She called their morning rides to school the only good part of waking up, and on the mornings when the fog was especially dense, she would lean forward in the pod and say it looked like they were going somewhere that didn't exist yet, which was the kind of thing that made him feel something he didn't have language for. A specific weight in his chest that wasn't sadness and wasn't quite joy, but was the nearest he ever got to either. The morning of October 14th was cold enough that his breath fogged the visor of his helmet, and Mila wore the extra layer he'd set out on the kitchen chair the night before without being asked. She had her backpack in her lap, and she was watching the fog the way she always did, and she said something he didn't catch over the engine noise, and he tilted his head toward her, and she repeated it louder. "Is there a new crossing guard?" He looked toward the school entrance as they came down Birch Avenue. Dennis was in his usual spot, thermos in hand. "No. Why?" She didn't answer right away, just looked at something beyond Dennis, something in the direction of the chain-link fence that lined the east side of the schoolyard, where the sidewalk ran along before cutting back toward the parking lot. Ryder followed her gaze, but there was nothing there, just the fence and the gray pavement and the mist and a paper cup tumbling in the wind. "No reason," she said. He let it go. He dropped her at the entrance the way he always did. Waited until Dennis acknowledged her, watched her push through the double doors, sat until the doors swung shut behind her. He didn't leave until she was inside. He had never once left until she was inside. Some habits aren't habits. They're the whole architecture of a life. He didn't know, riding back through the fog toward the shop, that she had seen the man at the fence for the first time that morning. She didn't tell him that day. Not that evening over the pasta he made from the recipe his mother had left in a handwritten card folded inside a copy of a cookbook he never opened except to find the card. Not that night when he checked under her bed and behind her closet door, the ritual she'd never asked him to stop even though she was technically too old for it, because she seemed to understand that it wasn't for her anymore. Not during the 20 minutes they spent at the kitchen table while she did her reading assignment, and he went over the parts order for a 74 shovelhead he'd been rebuilding for a man in Circleville who had more sentiment than sense when it came to that particular machine. She told him on the third day. It was a Thursday afternoon, just past 3. He was at the school for pickup. He always did pickup in the truck on days when the weather turned mean, and the weather that week had made up its mind about being mean. And she climbed into the passenger seat with her backpack and her library book, and she sat there for a moment without putting on her seatbelt, which she never forgot, which was the first sign. "Dad," she said. He was watching the rear view. A sedan had been idling near the far end of the parking lot for the last 4 minutes. He clocked it the way he clocked everything in a parking lot, automatically, thoroughly. The Army never really leaves. Yeah. There was a man at the fence again. He looked at her. Again. She met his eyes. 3 days. He was there in the mornings when you dropped me off, standing at the east fence by the sidewalk. He waved at me yesterday. She paused. Her voice was flat, careful, the voice she used when she was being precise about something. Today he called my name. The engine was still running. The heat was blowing. Outside, 2 kids chased each other across the wet blacktop, while a woman in a green coat tried to manage an umbrella and a stroller simultaneously. The sedan was still idling. "He said you sent him," Mila said. Everything in Ryder went still. The specific stillness that isn't calm. "He knew my name," she continued. "He said Dad sent me to walk you home today, but..." She looked down at the book in her lap. "You never call me Mila." He had called her Bean since she was 18 months old. Just Bean. Never Mila, except on official forms and at doctors' offices. Anyone who knew them, really knew them, knew that. "I didn't move," she said. "I just walked to the door." He reached across and put his hand over hers. She didn't flinch. She was watching his face with those eyes that saw too much, had always seen too much. The same dark eyes he saw in the bathroom mirror every morning. He kept his voice level with an effort that cost him something. "You did exactly right. I know," she said. "That's why I'm telling you now instead of then." He drove her home. He called his neighbor, Carol Marsh, a retired school teacher who had watched Mila before and who asked no questions about irregular requests, and he waited until Mila was inside and Carol's car was in the driveway before he picked up his phone. He sat in the truck in his own driveway, and he stared at the contact name on the screen for a long moment. The rain had started again, tapping the roof of the cab in an uneven rhythm. The field behind his property was lost in the low clouds. He thought about the sedan in the parking lot. He thought about the name the man had used. Mila, not Bean, and what that particular wrongness meant. He thought about a girl he hadn't let himself think about in years. His sister's name was Dana. She had been 14. He had been 22 and 6 weeks from his second deployment, which meant he was home but not present, existing in the halfway state of a man whose mind has already moved to the next theater of operations before his body has caught up. Dana had told him someone was following her home from the community pool. Told him twice. He'd said she was being dramatic, told her to stop taking the long route. 2 weeks later, she came home after being missing for 53 minutes, and she had never once in the 12 years since talked about what happened during those 53 minutes. And she didn't have to, because it was written in every way she moved through rooms, the way she sat with her back to walls, the way she flinched at certain sounds, the way she looked at him sometimes with an expression that wasn't blame and was therefore worse than blame. He pressed call. Gus Mercer picked up on the second ring. Gus was 51, built like a man who had spent 30 years telling gravity to go to hell, and he had been the president of the Black Ravens Denton chapter for 8 of those years. Before that, he'd been a Marine, before that a kid from Youngstown, who'd had 2 choices at 18 and had picked the one that required a uniform. His voice on the phone was the same as his voice in person. Unhurried, low, the voice of a man who had learned a long time ago that panic was a resource you spent and couldn't earn back. Talk, Gus said. Ryder talked, kept it brief, gave him the facts in the order they mattered. The fence, the mornings, the name, the sedan. When he finished, there was a pause on the line that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. You call the school? Mila's home. I'll call the school in the morning. Another pause. I'll make some calls tonight. Birch in second? Far corner of the lot. Silver sedan, couldn't get the plate from the angle I had. Okay. And then, without inflection, without drama, the thing that meant everything. We'll come to you. He didn't say thank you. That wasn't how it worked between them. He ended the call and sat another moment in the rain-dark cab, the windows fogging slowly from the inside, and he made himself breathe in the deliberate way the VA counselor had taught him years ago, and which he'd dismissed at the time and used almost every day since. 4 counts in. Hold. 6 counts out. The rain on the roof. The field in the fog. The light in the kitchen window where Mila was probably telling Carol about the book she was reading. He had not protected Dana. That was the fixed point in the geography of his failure. The thing he had organized the rest of his life around without ever quite admitting that was what he was doing. The army, the Ravens, the shop built on the edge of town where he could see the road in both directions, the custody fight that had cost him 18 months and most of his savings, and which he would do again without changing a single decision. The ritual at bedtime, the wool blanket in the pod, the drops at the door, the waits until she was inside, the parking lot surveillance he performed so automatically he barely registered it as vigilance anymore. He had not protected Dana. He would not fail again. By 8 that evening, 4 Harleys sat in his driveway in the freezing rain. Gus was there, jacket dark with rain, boots leaving wet prints across the concrete floor of the shop where Ryder had set up the folding table with the coffee maker and the mismatched mugs because when the Ravens came to you, you offered coffee. It was one of the unwritten things. There were many unwritten things. Beside Gus was Tommy Wick, who was 38 and had the kind of hands that told you he'd built things and broken things in roughly equal measure, and who had done 2 tours in Iraq and come home to find his marriage had expired in his absence, like something left too long in the refrigerator. Tommy didn't talk much. When he did, it was worth listening to. Ellis Crane was leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed and a mug of coffee he hadn't touched yet, watching Ryder with the focused attention of a man who was calculating angles. Ellis was 44, black, former Army Ranger, current certified mechanic, and the most technically precise thinker Ryder had ever met. He saw systems. He saw how parts connected. He was the one they called when emotion was getting in the way of clarity. And then there was Bo Lattimore, who was 29 and the youngest of them by a margin that sometimes showed and sometimes didn't, sitting backward on a shop stool with his forearms on the backrest and his chin on his forearms, watching Ryder explain the situation with the particular focused quiet of a young man who has decided to learn everything there is to learn from the people in the room and hasn't yet decided what to do with it all. Ryder laid it out again. The fence, the mornings, the name, the sedan. He put his phone on the table with the description of the car typed into his notes app. He said it plainly, without the particular kind of control that becomes its own kind of performance. He said, "My daughter was approached by a stranger who knew her name and who claimed I sent him. He said, she had the sense not to go near him. He said, I want to know who he is." The room was quiet for a moment. The rain was loud on the metal roof. The shop smelled of oil and cold and coffee. "School system," Ellis said. Every head in the room turned toward him. He knew her name, knew she was connected to you, knew the morning schedule. Ellis uncrossed his arms and set the coffee mug down. "That's not random. That's someone who had access to enrollment data, school records, pickup schedules." He looked at Ryder. "You had a consistent drop-off pattern?" 6:45 every weekday. "Same route?" "Mostly." Ellis nodded slowly, the way he nodded when a thing was confirming something he'd already suspected. "This isn't opportunistic. This was set up." The temperature in the room dropped 2 degrees without anything changing. Tommy Wick said quietly, "How long you been doing the same route?" 3 years. Nobody said anything for a moment. The rain, the coffee maker cycling off, the sound of a truck out on Route 9, far enough away to be theoretical. "Truck stop on 23 gets a lot of traffic this time of year," Gus said. "Seasonal workers, people passing through. Silver sedans sitting a lot would blend." "Might not be sitting," Tommy said. "Might be a regular stop." They decided on shifts. Not surveillance in the police sense, they had no authority and no illusions about their authority. But presence. The kind of presence that changes the geometry of a situation simply by existing. 2 ravens in rotation near the school each morning. Tommy and Bo on the truck stop on Route 23. Gus making a call to a contact in the Harlan County Sheriff's Department who owed him a favor that had been outstanding long enough to have earned interest. Ryder said he was calling the school in the morning. Ellis said he should also request the visitor log for the past 2 weeks. Gus said that was a good instinct. Nobody told Ryder to calm down or keep perspective or remember that it was probably nothing. They knew better. They had all been the person whose concern had been dismissed as excessive once already, most of them multiple times, and they had learned the precise weight of that particular dismissal. They stayed until 10. Bo fell asleep on the shop couch for 40 minutes, and nobody mentioned it because he'd been pulling double shifts at the auto parts warehouse since his roommate had bailed on his half of October rent, and everyone knew that, and nobody was going to make him feel bad about needing the sleep. Tommy washed the coffee mugs without being asked. Ellis left a printed note on the shop table with the plate search contact at the DMV he trusted, and a reminder that the request needed to come through official channels, which meant it needed to come through someone with a badge, which meant Gus's contact in Harlan County. After they left, Ryder stood in the doorway of the shop and listened to the Harleys recede into the rain and the dark, and he felt the thing he always felt when the Ravens left after a meeting. Not safety exactly, because safety was not a thing he had a clear relationship with, but something like the absence of a particular kind of aloneness, the kind that comes from being the only person in the room who understands the stakes. He went inside, checked the locks, front door, back door, the window latch in the kitchen that had been stiff since August, and which he'd been meaning to replace. He stood in the hallway outside Mila's room for a moment, listening to the sound of her breathing, which was even and deep and entirely unbothered, because she was 8, and she had done exactly the right thing, and she had told him, and she trusted that he would handle it, which was a trust that sat on him with a weight he didn't resent, but also didn't underestimate. He did not sleep well. He rarely slept well. But that night he lay in the dark and listened to the house, and the rain, and the occasional far-off sound of a truck on the highway, and he ran through everything Mila had told him with the specific systematic attention he'd been trained to give to tactical situations, which was the only mode he had left for things that mattered this much. He ran through the details. He ran through the gaps. He thought about the sedan. He thought about Ellis saying, "That's not random, that's set up." He thought about Dana. He was still awake at 3 in the morning when the text came from Tommy Wick. Silver sedan. Route 23 truck stop. Plates come back to a rental. Rented 12 days ago. Driver didn't go inside, just sat. Ryder stared at the screen for a long moment. Then Tommy sent a second message. Just 3 words. He's still there. Ryder was dressed in under 90 seconds. He sent a text to Carol Marsh. Emergency, need you at the house. I'll explain later. And he was pulling on his jacket when his phone buzzed again. This time Gus. Don't go alone. He waited 4 minutes for Gus to arrive. 4 minutes standing in his own driveway in the cold, the frozen grass crackling under his boots, the fog coming off the field in low gray rolls. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and he was perfectly still and perfectly awake, in the way that only happens when the adrenaline has been running long enough to feel like baseline. Gus pulled in without the headlights and cut the engine at the end of the drive. He dismounted in the dark and walked over and said nothing, just looked at Ryder with that flat, assessing look. And Ryder gave him a short nod that meant he was in control of himself, and Gus returned the nod that meant he accepted that accounting. They took the truck. Gus drove. The truck stop on Route 23 was the kind of place that looked different at 3 in the morning than it did at noon. The fluorescent overheads inside showing through the window glass in a yellow that was the color of old bruises. The pumps empty. One rig parked along the far wall with the cab lights on. The parking lot had 3 other vehicles in it. The silver sedan was near the back, under a light that was half dead and flickering. Tommy Wick was parked across the lot in his own truck, engine off. He'd been there since 11. They sat for 11 minutes. The sedan didn't move. The driver was visible as a shape behind the wheel, head down or leaning sideways, impossible to tell from the distance if he was sleeping or watching. Plates rental, Gus said. Not a question. Tommy confirmed it. Out of state? Illinois. Gus was quiet. His hands were on the steering wheel and he was watching the sedan with the same patient attention he gave to everything, which was the attention of a man who understood that waiting was not the same as doing nothing. He's not from here, Ryder said. No. But he knew her name. He knew her schedule. Yes. The flickering lot light went out entirely for 3 seconds and then came back. In the intermittent dark, the sedan looked like something that had been left there a long time ago and had not yet been discovered. I want to look in that car, Ryder said. You know you can't. I know. Gus pulled out his phone, dialed. Ryder listened to one side of a conversation that lasted 2 minutes and consisted mostly of Gus saying very little in a tone that communicated a great deal. When he hung up, he said, Harlan County's calling it in to the Denton PD. Suspicious vehicle. Request a welfare check. How long? 20 minutes, maybe. Ryder watched the sedan. The shape behind the wheel hadn't moved. 23 minutes later, a Denton PD cruiser turned into the lot. Ryder and Gus watched from across the lot as the officer approached the vehicle, tapped the window, stepped back. There was a long moment. The sedan's door opened. The man who stepped out was unremarkable in the way that certain kinds of danger is unremarkable. Medium height, unremarkable build, the kind of face that didn't hold on to itself, that you would describe afterward and find you had almost nothing specific to say. He was wearing a dark jacket, and he moved with the particular careful calm of someone who had rehearsed this scenario. He spoke to the officer for a moment, gestures small and cooperative, nothing that would escalate. The officer went back to the cruiser, came back with a flashlight. And then, with the officer standing there, the man reached back into the sedan and handed over something voluntarily, something from the console or the passenger seat. Ryder couldn't see what it was from where they sat. The officer looked at it again, and his whole posture changed. Gus saw it too. They both saw it, yeah. The way a person's body revises itself when it encounters something it wasn't expecting to encounter. The shoulders coming in, the stance shifting, the hand moving toward the radio on the vest. Within 4 minutes, 2 more cruisers were in the lot. Within 8 minutes, the man in the dark jacket was in handcuffs. Ryder sat with his hands flat on his thighs and watched the lights of the police cruisers paint the fog in alternating red and blue. And he said nothing. And Gus said nothing. and the lot smelled of diesel and cold asphalt and something else, something chemical and flat that might have been the particular smell of fear finally finding a shape to attach itself to. Ryder's phone buzzed. It was Tommy, from across the lot. What did they find? He typed back, "Don't know yet." He found out the next morning. Gus had the contact. The contact had the information. What the officer had found in the sedan, laid across the passenger seat in a wire-bound notebook with a plain gray cover, was a handwritten list. Names, ages, school names, pickup times, home streets but not full addresses, ranges rather than specifics, enough to narrow a search without committing to it. The kind of information that took time to compile and that was not compiled casually. Mila Knox, age 8, Denton Elementary. Morning drop, sidecar motorcycle. Afternoon pickup, blue truck. East fence sightline. No visible security camera. Her name was not the first on the list. There were 11 other names above hers. 3 of them had a single line drawn through them. The man's name, Ryder learned that day from the Denton PD officer who came to the shop to take his statement, was Warren Lester. He was 47 years old, from Rockford, Illinois, and he had a prior charge from 2011, a charge that had been pled down, the kind of plea that happens when the system is tired and overworked, and the defense attorney is better than the prosecutor, and the result is a thing you live with. The officer, a woman named Patel, who had the look of someone who had been doing this work long enough to stop being surprised and not long enough to stop being angry, asked Ryder to describe in detail what Mila had reported over the 3 mornings. He described it carefully, in order, without editorializing. When he was done, Officer Patel wrote something in her notebook and said, "Your daughter handled herself exceptionally." "I know," Ryder said. Patel looked at him with the kind of look that is not quite approval, but is in the neighborhood of it. The names in the notebook, we're treating this as a multi-jurisdictional matter. The FBI will likely be in contact. The crossed-out names, Ryder said, are those... I can't discuss the details of an active investigation. She paused, just barely. But I would recommend you check the national database for missing children in the affected age range, because that is public information. He checked. He found 3 names. 2 girls and a boy, ages 7 through 9, from 3 different states. The most recent had been missing for 11 days. Her name was Cassidy Holt. She was 9 years old. She was from a town in western Pennsylvania called Clinton, which was small enough that the coverage had stayed local, which was the way these things stayed hidden, not through active concealment, but through the passive invisibility of places that didn't generate enough noise to be heard anywhere else. Ryder sat with his phone in his hands in the quiet of the shop, and he looked at the photo of Cassidy Holt that her family had given to the local news. She was 9 years old, and she had braids, and she was laughing at something off camera, and she had been missing for 11 days. He put the phone face down on the workbench. He picked up a wrench. He held it. He set it back down. The shovelhead he'd been rebuilding for the man from Circleville sat on the stand in front of him, all its parts in their careful order, waiting to be reassembled. He stood in front of it for a long time without touching anything. 2 hours later, Gus called to tell him that the FBI had formally joined the case and that Warren Lester, currently in the Denton County holding facility, had said almost nothing since his arrest. Nothing about his source of information, nothing about the crossed-out names, nothing about any girl in any basement in Pennsylvania or anywhere else. And then Gus said the thing that landed like a cold hand on the back of Ryder's neck. They say he won't talk to the investigators, he won't talk to the FBI, but he asked for something. A pause. He asked to speak to the father of the girl at the fence. The shop was very quiet. The fluorescent light over the workbench buzzed faintly. Outside, the wind moved through the salvage yard with a sound like something unsatisfied. "Ryder," Gus said, "I heard you." "I told them no, you don't—" "I heard you, Gus." Another pause, longer. "It's not your job." "It's not about the job." He could hear Gus breathing on the other end, hear him thinking through it, calculating angles the way Gus always did, looking for the move that cost least and gave most. He heard Gus say carefully, "If Cassidy Holt is somewhere in Pennsylvania in the cold, 11 days is—" "I know what 11 days is." The line was quiet for a long moment. "I'll call the FBI," Gus said finally. "Not agreement, not approval. Just the acknowledgement of a man who understood that some decisions had already been made before the conversation started. You don't go in there without me knowing every detail, and you don't go in there alone. Understood. Ryder set the phone down. He stood in the shop for a minute. He looked at the flat black pod sitting in the corner where he parked it when the sidecar wasn't mounted, the wool blanket folded over the side. He thought about Mila saying it looked like they were going somewhere that didn't exist yet. He thought about Cassidy Holt and her braids and her laugh. He thought about Dana. He thought about an interrogation room, fluorescent lights, a man across a table. He thought about what you say to someone like that, whether anything you say matters, whether it ever does. He didn't know the answer. He didn't know if there was an answer. What he knew, what he had always known, deep in the framework of himself, in the same place where the watchfulness lived and the guilt lived, and the quiet love for an 8-year-old girl who called their morning rides the only good part of waking up, was that he would walk into that room, because Cassidy Holt had been somewhere cold and dark for 11 days, and no one had listened to Dana. He would not do both things wrong. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall on Denton, Ohio, soft and early and indifferent, coming down through the dark without hurry, covering the salvage yard and the highway and the frozen fields in a white that would look clean in the morning and would hide, as snow always does, everything that lay beneath it. Somewhere across town, Mila was at Carol Marsh's kitchen table, working on her reading assignment, unaware that her father had just made a decision that would put him across a table from the man who had learned her name and stood at her school fence 3 mornings in a row. And Warren Lester, in a cell in the Denton County holding facility, was waiting. He had asked for the father, and the father was coming. The snow that had started falling on Denton the night before was still coming down when Ryder pulled into the county facility parking lot at 8:47 in the morning, and it was the kind of snow that couldn't make up its mind. Too wet to be pretty, too thin to be serious, just cold and persistent, and coating everything in a gray-white layer that made the world look like it was being slowly erased. Gus was already there, parked at the far end of the lot in his truck, engine running, a curl of exhaust rising in the cold air. He didn't wave when Ryder pulled in beside him, just watched him through the glass with that flat, unreadable expression that wasn't unfriendly but wasn't warm either. The face Gus used when he'd made peace with a situation without necessarily approving of it. Ryder cut the engine and sat for a moment. His breath fogged the cab. He'd been up since 4, not sleeping so much as lying in the dark with his eyes open, running the conversation he was about to have in the way you run a route before you drive it, checking for turns you might miss, for the place where the road narrows and you can't see what's coming. He didn't know what he was going to say when he sat down across from Warren Lester. He'd stopped trying to script it somewhere around 5 in the morning and decided to go in with nothing planned, which was either wisdom or stupidity, and he hadn't decided which. He got out of the truck. The cold hit him across the face like a flat hand. Gus was already out of his own vehicle, collar up, both hands in his jacket pockets. He looked at Ryder with the assessing look, the one that measured things without naming them. You sleep? Some. That's a no. Ryder didn't argue. They walked together toward the entrance, boots on wet blacktop, the snow coming down sideways in the wind. Ellis know you're here? Ryder asked. Ellis knows everything, Gus said. That's his whole personality. It wasn't a joke exactly, but it landed somewhere near one, and Ryder felt something in his jaw unclench slightly. Not much. Enough. The FBI agent who met them at the facility entrance was named Colleen Marsh. No relation to Carol, as she clarified immediately, and with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to preempt the question. And she was 42, compact, with close-cut hair and the kind of eyes that took a complete inventory of you in the first 3 seconds and never mentioned what they found. She wore a blue jacket with the agency ID, and she shook Ryder's hand with a grip that wasn't performing anything. Mr. Knox, I want to be clear about a few things before we go in. She held his gaze. You are not law enforcement. You have no authority in this room. The interaction is voluntary on all sides, including yours. You can stop at any time. She paused. He asked for you by description, not by name. He said, the father with the motorcycle. We confirmed your identity through Officer Patel's report. I understand, Ryder said. Lester has said nothing of evidentiary value since his arrest. We have the notebook. We have circumstantial connection to the disappearance of Cassidy Holt and 2 other children. But circumstantial is not locational. She said it without looking away. Cassidy Holt has been missing 12 days as of this morning. The number sat in the cold air between them. What do you want from this? Gus asked. Not to Ryder, to Agent Marsh. She looked at him. Same thing you do. I want him to say where she is. And you think Ryder's going to get that out of him? I think Warren Lester asked for this meeting, which means he wants something from it. What he wants may be negotiable. She glanced back at Ryder. Or it may not be. I can't predict that. But 12 days in a Pennsylvania winter is... I know, Ryder said. The same thing he'd said to Gus the night before. She nodded, just once. I'll be in the observation room. There will be a camera. Nothing you say in there can be used against you in any legal proceeding. She paused. But I'd ask you to remember that the goal is the child. That's always been the goal, Ryder said. She looked at him one more beat, then turned and led them inside. Gus grabbed Ryder's arm just before the interior door. Light grip, nothing forceful. You come out of there and tell me everything. You hear me? Everything. Ryder looked at him. Gus's face in the fluorescent light of the facility corridor was older than it looked outdoors. The lines deeper, the eyes carrying the particular weight of a man who has sent people into difficult rooms before and knows the cost. I'll tell you everything, Ryder said. Gus released his arm. Let him go. The interrogation room was smaller than it looked in movies. It always was. White walls, a table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, a camera mounted in the upper corner with a red indicator light that was on. The fluorescent overhead buzzed at a frequency that sat just below conscious attention but above comfort, the kind of sound that accumulates in the back of your skull and adds to every other pressure in the room. Warren Lester was already seated. He looked, in the contained space of that room, even more unremarkable than he had appeared in the parking lot of the truck stop. He had the face of a man who had deliberately cultivated unmemorability. Nothing sharp about him, nothing that caught or held the eye, the kind of neutral that was its own form of camouflage. He was wearing the facility-issued clothing, and his hands were folded on the table in front of him with a careful stillness that was not relaxed. His eyes tracked Ryder from the moment the door opened. Ryder came in alone, as agreed. He pulled out the chair across from Lester and sat down. He did not say anything. He put his hands flat on the table, not folded, not fisted, just open and still. And he looked at Warren Lester and waited. The silence lasted almost a full minute. Lester spoke first. His voice was moderate, pitched to not carry, the voice of a man who was used to being in rooms where he wanted only certain people to hear him. You came. You asked, Ryder said. Lester looked at his hands, then back at Ryder. Your daughter. Don't. Lester stopped. Something moved across his face. Not fear, not quite, more like recalibration. He was taking Ryder's measure the same way Ryder was taking his, and Ryder let him because there was nothing in his own face worth hiding. He wasn't there to perform anger. He wasn't there to perform anything. Why me? Ryder asked. You're the father. There are other names in that notebook. Lester looked at the table. I wanted to see you. Why? It wasn't a question the way questions normally are. It had no upturn in it, no request. It was a demand made in a flat voice by a man who was conserving everything he had. Lester was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was slightly different, slightly lower, slightly less controlled. I wanted to know if you were what they said. Who's they? No answer. Ryder leaned forward, just slightly, elbows on the table. He didn't raise his voice. There's a 9-year-old girl somewhere in Pennsylvania. 12 days. The temperature last night in western Pennsylvania was 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Lester's jaw moved. A small movement. The kind a person makes when something lands somewhere they were trying to keep protected. I'm not going to threaten you, Ryder said. I'm not going to tell you what I'll do to you if you don't talk, because that's not why I'm here. He paused. Let that sit. I'm here because I have a daughter who was at a school fence 3 mornings in a row and had the sense to know something was wrong and tell me. She told me because she trusted me. His voice was level. You know what I did the last time a child trusted me about something like this? Lester was watching him. The recalibration had stopped. He was just watching. Nothing, Ryder said. I did nothing. I told her she was overreacting. I was 22 years old and I was leaving for Afghanistan in 6 weeks. And I told my 14-year-old sister she was being dramatic. He could feel the words coming from somewhere lower than his chest, somewhere that had been sealed for a long time. She was missing for 53 minutes. I don't know what happened during those 53 minutes because she's never told me and she's never going to tell me, and I have to live with the version of it that my imagination built, which is probably not better than the truth and might be worse. The fluorescent light buzzed. The camera light was red. I failed her, Ryder said. I can't undo that. There's no version of the rest of my life where I undo that. He looked at Warren Lester steadily. But there is a version where Cassidy Holt comes home. And that version only exists if you tell me where she is. The silence in the room was complete and pressurized. Lester's hands on the table were no longer folded. They were flat, palms down, pressing into the surface. His breathing had changed. Ryder could see it, the chest moving differently, the inhale catching somewhere in the middle. They told me you were dangerous, Lester said, barely above a whisper. I am. They said you'd... Who told you that? Ryder didn't move. Who told you about me? Lester's eyes slid to the side, Dutz. Not to the camera, not to the door, just sideways, the involuntary drift of a person who has just said more than they intended. He pressed his lips together. Someone told you who I was, Ryder said. Someone told you to ask for me specifically. Who was it? Nothing. The name's in that notebook, Ryder said. Someone gave you those names, pickup times, routes, camera positions. He watched Lester's face. That's not information you gather from a parking lot. That's inside information. Who gave it to you? Lester's jaw was tight. His eyes had come back to Ryder's face, and they stayed there with the fixed quality of a man who was trying to decide something under enormous pressure and hadn't decided it yet. Cassidy Holt, Ryder said. 19 degrees last night. Something in Lester's face changed, finally, slowly, the way ice changes. Not a crack, but a shift, a settling, a loss of structural confidence. He told Ryder where the girl was. He said it in one sentence, quietly, into the buzzing fluorescent air of the interrogation room. And when he finished, he looked at his hands and said nothing else. Ryder stood up. He went to the door. He looked back at Lester once, not with hatred, not with satisfaction, with something that had no clean name, the complicated residue of a man who has just done something he didn't know he was capable of doing and isn't sure yet what it cost him. He walked out. In the corridor, Agent Marsh was already on her phone, walking fast, her voice clipped and precise. Gus was standing against the wall, and he looked at Ryder's face and said nothing, just straightened up and fell into step beside him. They were outside in the cold before Gus spoke. She's somewhere specific? Abandoned property. He said there's a farmhouse, decommissioned, off a rural route in Fayette County. He gave an address. Ryder stopped walking. He stood in the parking lot in the snow, and he breathed. He gave it up. Gus was quiet for a moment. You okay? The question was sincere in the way Gus's questions were always sincere, direct, without performance, genuinely wanting the honest answer. Ryder considered it. He thought about what it meant to be okay. He thought about the interrogation room and the thing he'd said about Dana, said out loud for the first time to anyone, including himself. He thought about Lester's face when the decision finally came. I don't know yet, Ryder said. That's fair, Gus said. They drove back to the shop. Not because there was work to do. There was no work today, the shovelhead from Circleville sitting patient and disassembled, but because the shop was where they went, all of them, when things needed processing. It was the place that held the weight without comment. The oil smell and the cold concrete and the mismatched tools on the pegboard and the couch where Bo had slept for 40 minutes 3 nights ago. It was the geography of what the Ravens were when they weren't out on the road, which was men who needed a place to set things down. Ellis was there when they arrived. He had a laptop open on the folding table, and he was looking at something that involved a map, a county outline, a cluster of route lines. He looked up when they came in and read their faces and said, He talked. He talked, Gus confirmed. Fayette County, Ryder said. Ellis turned back to the laptop and started typing. Tommy came in 20 minutes later, shaking snow off his jacket, and Bo came in behind him still in his warehouse coveralls from the early shift. They stood around the folding table and Ellis showed them the satellite image of the property he'd found. A farmhouse on a dead-end rural route, outbuildings, set back from the main road, last recorded occupancy several years prior. Ryder stared at the image and felt something in his chest that was not relief and was not fear, but was the anticipation of one and the knowledge of the other. FBI's moving, Gus said. They have the location. It's their operation. We know that, Tommy said. I'm saying it anyway, because I want everyone in this room to be very clear that our part in this ended in that interrogation room. The room was quiet. Ryder could feel eyes on him, not accusatory, just aware, the way the Ravens were always aware of each other, tracking the emotional weather of the group the way experienced riders track the actual weather, constantly and without making a thing of it. Ryder, Gus said, I hear you. Do you? Ryder looked at him. Gus was standing with his arms at his sides and his eyes were direct, and there was nothing in his face that was unkind, but there was something that was firm in the particular way that things which have been thought through carefully are firm, not rigid, not reflexive, but settled. You walked into that room and you did something that maybe nobody else could have done, Gus said. That's real. I'm not diminishing that. But what comes next belongs to the people with badges and jurisdiction and the legal authority to go into that property, and if we go anywhere near that property, we become a problem instead of a resource. You understand me. Ryder understood him. He understood him completely, and he agreed with him entirely, and he still felt the thing in his chest that wanted to get in the truck and drive to Fayette County, which was not a rational impulse and was not one he intended to act on, but which was present and real and not going to be talked out of existence by correct reasoning. I understand you, he said. Gus held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded. Ellis said, ETA, if they mobilized immediately, is roughly 3 hours, depending on road conditions and exact property access. 3 hours. Everyone in the room did the same math. 12 days plus 3 more hours. 19 degrees. Tommy put his hands in his pockets and looked at the floor. Bo was very still, coveralls still wet from the snow, his face doing the thing it did when he was working to appear older than he was. Ellis closed the laptop slowly. They made coffee. They didn't talk much. The snow was still coming down outside and the shop was cold in the way old metal buildings are always cold. Not dramatically, just constantly. The chill sitting in the floor and the walls and the air in a way that no amount of space heaters entirely corrected. Ryder sat on the workbench with his hands around a mug and stared at the disassembled shovel head and thought about nothing useful and everything important. It was Bo who broke the silence, eventually, in the careful voice of someone who had been holding something for a while. The guy said someone told him about you, about Ryder specifically. The room shifted, not physically, just shifted. I heard that part, Gus said. So whoever gave him the names in that notebook, they also gave him Ryder's name and told him to... Bo stopped, looked at Ryder. To do what exactly? Target Mila specifically because of you. We don't know that, Ellis said. We don't not know it, Bo said. Which was the kind of thing Bo said sometimes. Unformed, but accurate. The raw material of a conclusion before anyone had shaped it. Everyone heard it and no one dismissed it. Ryder set his mug down. He said, they told me you were dangerous. He looked at Gus. Someone told him to expect me to come in there hostile, threatening, like it was leverage. If Ryder Knox comes in there like a bomb going off, that's useful to Lester somehow. Creates a story, creates a narrative where the biker threatened him. Ellis was very still. And instead you were, not that. So the expected script didn't run. No. Tommy from across the shop. Someone wanted you discredited? The word landed heavily. Or arrested, Ellis said. Or at minimum. Removed from proximity to the investigation. He looked at Gus. If Ryder had gone in there and threatened Lester, gotten physical, anything on camera, he'd be the story instead of Lester, Gus finished. The fluorescent light over the workbench buzzed. Outside, a wind gust moved through the salvage yard and something metal shifted and settled. "Someone inside," Ryder said. No one answered. No one needed to. The words were already in the room, and they were not going back. Someone had given Warren Lester the names, the schedules, the camera positions, the knowledge of Ryder Knox. His daughter's name, her school, the east fence sightline, the sidecar, the consistent morning drop-off time. That information didn't come from surveillance alone. It came from records, from a system, from someone who sat inside the ordinary trusted infrastructure of Denton's civic life and had been quietly feeding it outward for God knows how long. "We can't go to Patel with a theory," Ellis said practically. "We need something specific." "We don't go to Patel yet," Gus said. "Gus, we go to Patel when we have something that doesn't get us patted on the head and sent home." His voice was measured, controlled, the voice he used in meetings when the temperature was climbing and he needed to be the thing that didn't climb with it. "We are not investigators. We are not law enforcement. What we are is people who know something is wrong and need to know enough to hand it to the right hands without it getting lost." Ellis held his gaze. The dynamic between them was old and honest. They disagreed sometimes, and neither one pretended otherwise, and the disagreements never became personal because they were both, at their core, trying to get to the same place by slightly different routes. "Okay," Ellis said. "So what do we do?" "We think," Gus said, "about who had access, about how long this has been running, about why Mila Knox specifically." He looked at Ryder. "You have any enemies inside the school system?" The question was direct, and Ryder gave it the time it deserved. He thought through the people at Denton Elementary, the principal, the office staff, the teachers he'd met at pickup, the crossing guard Dennis, who he nodded to every morning, the woman at the front desk who always looked at his cut for a half-second too long before she smiled. He ran through them slowly, looking for the snagged edge, the thing that felt wrong in retrospect. "No one obvious," he said. "But I don't have a lot of relationships inside the school. I do drop off and pick up. I go to the parent meetings when Mila's teacher requests it. I'm not inside that building much." "Mila's teacher," Tommy said. "How long?" "Mrs. Calhoun, 2nd grade. She's had her since September." "Before that?" "Mrs. Tirado, 1st grade. Before that, Miss Ferris, kindergarten." "All good relationships?" Gus asked. "As far as I know, Mila never had a complaint." He paused. "She never brought complaints home. He stopped, recalibrated. "I should ask her more directly." "Not yet," Gus said immediately. "She doesn't need to carry this." "She's already carrying it. She's carrying the fence, the stranger. That's done. She handled it. She told you. That chapter is closed for her." Gus's voice was careful without being gentle. "You open the someone inside the school chapter for an 8-year-old, and she doesn't go back to normal at Denton Elementary. She goes back looking at every adult in that building as a potential threat. You don't want that for her." Ryder's jaw tightened. He looked at Gus. He wanted to argue, could feel the argument forming, and then he looked at it clearly, the way he tried to look at things clearly when the emotion was running hot, and he saw that Gus was right, and he hated that Gus was right. And he said nothing. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Gus said. It was early afternoon when Gus's phone rang. He stepped outside to take it, and everyone in the shop watched the door close behind him without quite looking like they were watching. The silence inside was tight. The coffee had gone cold. Bo was sitting on the floor with his back against the workbench, eyes closed, not sleeping, just existing in the posture of someone waiting for the next thing. Gus came back in after 6 minutes. He closed the door and he stood in the middle of the shop, and his face was doing the thing it did when the news was not simple, not good, not bad, but complicated in a way that needed careful handling. "They found the property," he said. Nobody breathed. She was there. The relief that moved through the room was almost physical. Bo's eyes opened. Tommy put his head back and looked at the ceiling. Ellis let out a long, slow exhale through his nose. "Alive?" Ryder asked. The word came out stripped of everything except its own weight. "Alive," Gus said. "Hypothermic, dehydrated. They're moving her to a hospital in Pittsburgh, but alive." Ryder sat very still on the workbench. He could feel the blood moving in his hands. He could feel the particular kind of exhaustion that comes when something you've been bracing against doesn't happen. A different kind of tired from the kind that comes from impact, looser and stranger and not entirely comfortable. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment. When he lowered them, Gus was watching him. "Dana," Gus said quietly. Ryder looked at him. The name was not a surprise. This Gus knew had always known the broad outline, the way the Ravens knew each other's fault lines without always naming them. But hearing it said out loud in the shop, in daylight, in the aftermath of a thing that had almost broken the same way and hadn't, landed differently than he expected. "Yeah," he said. Gus nodded. Nothing more than that. He didn't push it. He didn't wrap it in language. He just nodded, the way a man nods at something that needs acknowledging and not dissecting. And Ryder was grateful for it with the particular gratitude that exists between people who have been through enough to know the difference. They stayed in the shop until evening. Nobody had anywhere specific to be, and nobody said so. Bo fell asleep again, this time on the couch, fully and without apology, and this time Tommy put a jacket over him. Ellis worked on something on the laptop. Not the case, something else. A parts cross-reference for a customer. The ordinary business of ordinary life continuing inside the larger thing. Ryder worked on the shovelhead for a while, not because progress needed to happen today, but because his hands needed to be doing something his brain understood. The snow had stopped by 4 in the afternoon, and the light coming through the shop window was the low flat gray of a winter afternoon in Ohio, the kind that feels less like light and more like the absence of complete dark. Route 9 was quiet. The salvage yard was white and still. It was Tommy who first said what everyone had been not saying. He was standing by the window with a mug of fresh coffee, and he said it quietly, without looking at anyone in particular. If there's someone inside the school district who's been running this, giving out names, feeding information, how long has it been going on? Ellis said, "Long enough that 3 names in that notebook are crossed out." "3 children," Tommy said. 3. The shop was very quiet. "Cassidy Holt was lucky," Tommy said. It wasn't a platitude. It was a fact, stated with the flat effect of a man who had seen enough of the world to know how wide the margin between outcomes could be. "Yeah," Ryder said. "The others weren't." "No." Tommy turned from the window. He looked at Ryder. "So whoever is inside is still inside. Right now, today, while we're sitting here." Ryder set down the wrench he'd been holding. He looked at the parts spread on the workbench. He looked at his own hands. "Yeah," he said. "And Mila goes back to school on Monday." The sentence sat in the air of the shop like a match that hadn't been struck yet. Gus said, "We don't know the inside person is at Denton Elementary specifically. Could be district-wide, administration, IT records department." "Could be," Tommy said. He wasn't arguing. He was just not letting the comfortable version of the sentence have the room to itself. "We don't send Mila back until we know," Ryder said. It was not a question or a proposal. It was a decision already made that he was informing them of. "And we find out who it is." Gus looked at him. The look was long. "How?" "Ellis," Ryder said. Ellis turned from the laptop. He had the expression of a man who had seen this coming. "The public records request Patel recommended. School visitor logs, access records for student databases, administrative staff rotation. Some of that is legally accessible." "Some," Gus said. "Some," Ellis agreed. "The rest—" He paused. "I have a contact at the district IT office. Not a favor. An actual professional contact. She did some consulting for a business I helped build a network for 3 years ago. I could make a call." "Would she talk?" "She might ask questions we can't answer, but she might also have noticed something already." He closed the laptop. "Strange access patterns, unusual queries in the record system. If someone's been pulling names and schedules, there's a log somewhere. There's always a log." Gus looked at the floor for a moment, thinking it through. The Ravens were not an impulsive organization. That was one of the things people who didn't know them never understood. They assumed the leather and the machines translated to recklessness, when in fact the men who'd survived enough to earn those patches had learned caution the hard way and never forgot the lesson. Gus had seen men run at problems, and he had seen men think their way through problems, and he knew which one got people home. "One call," he said to Ellis. "Careful, nothing specific. You're looking for patterns, not accusations." Ellis nodded. "And Ryder?" Gus looked at him. "You keep Mila home for now. You tell the school she has a cold. You don't tell them anything else." "Because the inside person might be at the school." "Because the inside person might be at the school," Gus confirmed. Ryder looked at his hands again. He thought about Mila at Carol Marsh's kitchen table, her library book, the way she looked up when he came through the door, the way she always registered his return with that slight adjustment in her posture, the unconscious relaxation of a person whose baseline tension drops when a specific person is present. He thought about sending her back into that building without knowing. "Okay," he said. The evening came down over the shop and the salvage yard and the frozen Ohio fields, and they stayed until the last of the coffee was gone and the cold had settled so completely into the metal walls that it would take until noon the next day for the space heaters to push it back. They left in ones and twos, the Harleys starting up in the dark outside, exhaust smoke drifting white in the night air before dissolving, headlights sweeping across the lot as they turned onto Route 9. Ryder was the last one to leave. He locked the shop and stood in the cold for a moment, keys in hand, listening to the silence that the highway makes after the last set of headlights has disappeared. That particular absence of sound that is itself a kind of sound. He looked at the sky. The clouds had cleared during the afternoon and the stars were out over the fields, in the specific cold brightness that only happens in Ohio winter when the humidity drops and the air has nothing left to hide behind. He drove home to find Mila awake past her bedtime, sitting on the couch with Carol Marsh and the library book about moons and planets. And when he came in, she looked up and said, "Carol says Jupiter has 80 moons." 92 now, Ryder said. "They found more." Mila looked at Carol with the expression of someone whose source has just been updated. Carol raised her hands in a gesture of concession. He sent Carol home with the coffee he pressed on her and the money she refused twice before accepting. And he got Mila through the bedtime routine, teeth, water, the light off in the bathroom, but not in the hall. And he sat on the edge of her bed in the hall lit dark, and she said, "Is everything okay?" He looked at her. He thought about what to say and what not to say, and he thought about what Gus had said about not opening the next chapter for an 8-year-old, and he thought about the difference between lying and choosing. "Getting there," he said. She seemed to consider this. Then she asked, "Is the man from the fence in trouble?" "Yes." "Good," she said. Simply, without heat. A statement of fact. He checked under the bed, he checked the closet. He stood in the doorway for a moment after she'd pulled the blanket up, looking at her in the half-dark, the way her hair spread on the pillow, the particular way she breathed, even and slow, the easy breathing of a person who has decided to trust that the right people are awake. He stood there, and he let himself feel the full weight of the evening, of the day, of Cassidy Holt alive in a Pittsburgh hospital, and the notebook, with the crossed-out names and the shape of a conversation in an interrogation room that he would be a long time sorting through. He let himself feel it, and then he went back to being the person who was going to figure out who was inside. He had just poured himself a glass of water in the kitchen when his phone buzzed on the counter. Not a call, a text. From Ellis. Made the call. He stared at the screen, waited. 30 seconds, 40, the kitchen quiet around him, the refrigerator running, the house settling in the cold night. Second message from Ellis. She noticed something 3 weeks ago. Unusual administrative login after hours. She flagged it internally. No response. Ryder set the glass down. Third message. 2 words. Ellis rarely used more than 2 words when 2 were sufficient, but these 2 sat on the screen with the weight of a door slamming shut in a room where there was still something inside. She's scared. Ryder stared at the message. He looked up at the kitchen window, at the dark outside, at the reflection of himself standing at the counter in the kitchen light. He looked like what he was, a man who had thought he was at the end of something and had just discovered he was at the beginning of something else, something longer and closer to home, and more dangerous in the specific way that things are most dangerous when they are no longer abstract. He picked up the phone and typed back, "Who logged in?" Ellis's response took 4 minutes. 4 minutes in which the house was very quiet, and the road outside was empty, and the night was clear and cold and perfectly indifferent to what was about to happen. The response came. Ryder read the name. He read it again. He knew the name, not well, not personally, but he knew it the way you know the names of people who are part of the architecture of ordinary life, the names that appear on official forms and are spoken by secretaries and sit behind the desks that process the paperwork that holds a community together. A name from inside the Denton Unified School District Administration. A name that would have had access to every record, every schedule, every enrolled child's information across the entire district for the last several years. A name he had almost certainly seen on a form he'd signed the day he enrolled Mila. He set the phone down on the counter. He put both hands flat on the kitchen counter and he breathed. 4 counts in, hold, 6 counts out. And he looked at the window and the dark and his own reflection looking back, and he thought about the crossed out names, and the 11 days in a Pennsylvania winter, and the inside login after hours, and a woman in an IT office somewhere in Denton who had noticed and flagged it and heard nothing back. He thought about Mila upstairs, breathing slow and even, trusting the right people were awake. His phone buzzed one more time. Not Ellis? Not Gus? Officer Patel. The text read, Mr. Knox, we need to talk tonight. Something has come up in the investigation that directly concerns you. Are you available? He looked at the text for a long moment. He looked at it, and at Ellis's message above it, and at the name Ellis had sent. And he understood, with the particular cold clarity of a man whose gut and brain have just arrived at the same destination from opposite directions, that the thing was not contained. It was not over. It was not a stranger from Illinois with a notebook. It was here. It had been here the whole time. It had a name and an office and a desk inside the building where he dropped Mila every morning at 6:45 and waited until she was through the door before he left, because he had learned to wait, because he had learned what happened when he typed back, yes, where? Patel's response came in under a minute. Not the station, somewhere neutral. You know the diner on Merchant Street? He knew it. Open until midnight, corner booth visibility in both directions. The kind of place that stayed busy enough to provide cover and quiet enough that a conversation didn't carry. He typed, 30 minutes. He went upstairs. He stood in Mila's doorway for 10 seconds, not checking, just being present. The way you stand in a room before you leave it for an uncertain amount of time, and you want to carry the specific quality of the air with you. She was asleep, completely, the way children sleep when they have decided the world is being managed by someone else. He pulled her door to without closing it. He called Gus from the truck. Gus picked up on the first ring, which meant he hadn't been asleep either. Ryder told him about Patel's text, told him about Ellis's messages, said the name Ellis had sent. There was a silence on Gus's end that had a specific texture. Not surprise, exactly. More like the silence of a man who has been waiting for a thing to have a shape, and has just been given the shape, and is now measuring it against everything else he knows. Denton Unified, Gus said. District Administration. Records access. How long? We don't know. Another silence. Go to the diner. Hear what Patel has. Don't give her Ellis's contact. Not yet. We don't know what they already have, and we don't want to hand them something that gets a civilian pulled into an interview room at midnight. Understood. I'll call Ellis. Tell him to sit tight. A pause. Ryder? Yeah. Whatever Patel tells you tonight, you call me after. Doesn't matter what time. I will. The diner on Merchant Street was 3/4 empty at 10:15 on a Thursday night in October. The counter stools held 2 men who looked like they'd been there since the breakfast shift and had simply chosen not to leave, and a teenager in a fast food uniform eating pie with the focused desperation of someone who had 30 minutes before a shift started. The corner booth was open. Ryder took it with his back to the wall, which was not a choice he made consciously and hadn't been for 15 years. Patel arrived 7 minutes after he did. She was in civilian clothes, a dark jacket, no visible badge, but you could see the badge anyway, in the way she moved through a room, in the way her eyes did a complete circuit of the space before she sat down. She slid into the booth across from him and waited until the server had done the coffee rounds and moved away before she said anything. She looked, Ryder thought, like someone who had just found out a thing they had been hoping not to find out. The investigation into Warren Lester opened a secondary thread this afternoon, she said. When the FBI ran his known associates and his financial records, they found a payment trail. Small transactions structured to avoid flags. A total of 11 payments over 14 months. Ryder held his coffee mug and said nothing. The account receiving those payments belongs to a shell company registered in Delaware. The company has no public-facing business, but the account is linked through 2 intermediate transfers to a name. She looked at him steadily. The name is Gregory Voss. Ryder did not know the name. He said so. Gregory Voss is 53 years old. He has no criminal record. He has been employed by the Denton Unified School District for 11 years, most recently as Deputy Director of Student Records and Administrative Systems. She paused. He has full database access. Every enrolled student in the district, emergency contacts, family structure, pickup authorization records, schedule data. He can also access the district's building security systems, camera placements, coverage zones, staff entry logs. The diner was quiet around them. The counter radio was playing something that had been popular 6 years ago. The coffee was bad and hot, and Ryder drank it anyway. 11 payments, he said. 14 months. How many names are in that notebook? Patel held his gaze. 14. He set the mug down. He looked at it. He thought about the number 14 and the number of payments and the 14 months and the way those things fit together with the mechanical precision of something that had been designed rather than happened. He wasn't passing information to Lester specifically, Ryder said. No, our working theory is that Voss was a supplier, multiple buyers. Lester was one of them. She let that land. We don't know yet how many buyers. The teenager at the counter got up, checked his phone, and left. The door swung shut. Outside, a car moved slowly down Merchant Street in the snow-reflected light. My daughter's name was in that notebook, Ryder said. His voice was even. It cost him to keep it even. Yes, Voss put it there. We believe so. He's at the district now, tonight? He was suspended pending investigation as of 6 this evening. He's been informed of nothing specific. It was framed as an administrative matter. Patel looked at him carefully. I'm telling you this because I believe you deserve to know the shape of what's happening, and because... She stopped, started again. Because something came up in his records that you need to know about before you hear it from someone else. The way she said it changed the temperature of the booth. He's been employed by the district for 11 years, Patel said. Before that, he worked in a different administrative capacity, a community recreation center in Mansfield. A pause. Mansfield is 40 miles from Denton. Ryder waited. The community recreation center in Mansfield served a largely residential area. After-school programs, summer youth programming. He was the administrator of record from 2009 to 2012. She put her hands flat on the table. In the summer of 2011, there were 2 complaints filed against a staff member at that center. Complaints from families of minors. The complaints were reviewed internally and dismissed. No charges were filed. The staff member continued in his position until the center's program funding was cut in 2012. She met his eyes. Gregory Voss reviewed and dismissed those complaints himself. The sound in Ryder's ears was something that had nothing to do with the diner or the radio or the snow outside. It was an interior sound, the sound of pieces landing in order, of the particular silence that follows impact. 2011, he said. Patel said nothing. She was watching him. My sister, Ryder said. The words came out flat and separated, each one placed carefully because if he didn't place them carefully, something else was going to come out instead. Dana Knox, she was 14, summer of 2011. She used the pool at the Mansfield Community Recreation Center. The corner booth was very quiet. The counter radio played. The 2 men on the stools hadn't moved. Patel's eyes did not leave his face. She said, carefully, precisely, I know. The blood in Ryder's hands went cold and then hot, and then cold again, and he pressed both palms flat on the tabletop because the tabletop was real and solid, and he needed something real and solid right now. You already knew, he said. We found Dana's name in Voss's personnel file, attached to a complaint from 2011. The complaint was filed by a parent, not Dana herself, another family. But Dana's name appeared as a corroborating witness. Patel's voice was very steady. The complaint was one of the two that Voss dismissed. Ryder looked at the table. He looked at the grain of the laminate surface and the ring his coffee mug had left, and the particular flatness of the diner light on everything it touched. 12 years. He had spent 12 years carrying the weight of what he hadn't done, what he hadn't heard, what he told himself was Dana being dramatic. He had built his whole life around the absence of that failure. The shop on the edge of town, the ravens, the custody fight, the bedtime ritual, the drops at the door. He had organized himself entirely around not failing again. And the man who had not been stopped when stopping him might have changed everything for Dana. That man had been 40 miles away, moving upward through administrative structures, accumulating access, turning his position into a supply line. Does Dana know? Ryder asked. Not from us. We don't have contact information for her. She's in Akron. He said it without deciding to. She doesn't... We don't talk often. I understand. She doesn't know I'm involved in this case. I understand, Patel said again, and her voice had the quality of a person who genuinely understood and was not going to push. Ryder sat very still for a long moment. He thought about Dana in Akron, in whatever apartment she lived in whatever careful life she had built around the thing that had happened in the summer of 2011. He thought about her telling him twice about the person following her home from the pool. He thought about himself at 22, 6 weeks from Afghanistan, too far inside his own head to hear her clearly. He thought about 53 minutes. He thought about Gregory Voss behind a desk reviewing a complaint and checking a box and filing it away. He needs to be arrested tonight, Ryder said. That process is underway. The FBI has the financial records. The suspension was the first step. It prevents him from accessing the district systems while the warrant is being prepared. She held his gaze. It will happen. I'm telling you that clearly because I need you to let it happen through the correct channels. He looked at her. She was watching him with the eyes that took inventory, and what they were taking inventory of right now was whether the man across from her was going to make a decision that would break the case or complicate it or put him in a cell next to the man he wanted to get to. I hear you, he said. Mr. Knox. She said it with the emphasis of someone choosing their words with total precision. I need you to do more than hear me. I need you to tell me that you are going to go home tonight and stay there. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the coffee mug. He looked at his hands on the table. Go home and stay there, he said. Yes. And you'll call me when he's in custody. Yes? He stood up. He put money on the table for the coffee. He looked at Officer Patel, who was still sitting in the booth watching him with the patient vigilance of a woman who had correctly read the room and was not going to relax until he was out the door. Thank you, he said, for telling me yourself. She nodded. Go home, Mr. Knox. He went to his truck. He sat in the parking lot on Merchant Street with the engine off and the cold coming in, and he called Gus. He said everything. All of it. The 14 payments, the 14 names, the shell company, the suspension. And then the part that came after, the part about Mansfield in 2011 and a complaint dismissed by the man who had reviewed it himself. Gus said nothing for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, stripped of its normal controlled quality, something rougher underneath. Dana. Yeah. She doesn't know. No. Ryder. Gus stopped, started again. You need to... I know. You need to call your sister. I know, Gus. A long exhale on the line. Where are you right now? Merchant Street. Truck. I'm going home. You're going home. That's what I said. A pause. I'll be in my truck on Route 9 in 20 minutes. If you need, I'll be fine. I know you'll be fine, Gus said. I'll still be on Route 9. He drove home. He drove the way he drove when things were happening inside him that he couldn't let happen inside him while he was behind the wheel. Carefully, deliberately, all attention on the road and the darkness and the familiar bends and the frost on the shoulders and the way the headlights caught the snow still lying in the fields. He drove and breathed and did not think about Gregory Voss or 2011 or Dana or the 53 minutes. He thought about those things the moment he stopped the truck in his driveway. He sat in the dark cab for 10 minutes. He sat there with both hands in his lap, and he let it move through him. All of it, the whole 12-year architecture of his guilt, reshaping itself around a new understanding that did not make it smaller, but made it different. He had failed Dana. That was still true. He had not listened. That was still true. But the thing that had happened to her had not happened because of one 22-year-old who didn't listen. It had happened because a man in an administrative position had looked at a complaint and dismissed it, and then moved 40 miles away and built himself a better system, and had been doing it ever since. And the world had let him, the way the world lets things continue when they are quiet and institutional and don't make noise. He went inside. He checked the locks. He went upstairs and stood in Mila's doorway for the second time that night. She was still asleep. She would be asleep for hours. She was safe. In the specific way things could be called safe tonight. The man from the fence was in custody, the farmhouse in Pennsylvania had been found, Voss had been suspended, and the warrant was coming. Safe in the way that tonight was safe, which was not the same as the absence of all danger, but was the closest thing available. He went to his room. He sat on the edge of the bed. He picked up his phone. He found Dana's number. He looked at it. He thought about calling at 10:45 on a Thursday night, thought about the phone ringing in her apartment in Akron, thought about her voice answering with the caution she used for calls she wasn't expecting. He thought about what he would say. He didn't call. He sat with the phone in his hand and he told himself it was too late, that she was probably asleep, that this was the kind of conversation you didn't have at 10:45 on a Thursday through a phone in a dark bedroom. He told himself all of that carefully and precisely, and all of it was partially true, and underneath the partial truth was the thing that was completely true. He didn't know how to say it. He didn't know how to tell his sister that the man who should have stopped it hadn't, and that he had been here all along, and that Ryder had been 40 miles away and hadn't known, and that for 12 years he'd been carrying blame for a failure that was bigger and older and more institutional than any one person's inattention. He didn't know if that made it better or worse. He suspected it made it both. He lay down on top of the covers without undressing, and he looked at the ceiling and he listened to the house. The furnace cycling, a branch against the back window. The specific quality of silence that belongs to a house with a sleeping child in it. Present, inhabited, the silence of something being protected. His phone buzzed at 11:58. Patel. He's in custody. He stared at the message. Then he typed, "Thank you." He put the phone on the nightstand. He closed his eyes. He thought, for the first time in a long time, in the specific way that things become real only when their danger has passed, about what it meant that it was over, that Voss was in custody, that the warrant had come through, that the FBI had the financial records and the payment trail, and 11 years of administrative access logs that would, when fully examined, show the exact shape of what he had been doing and for how long and to how many families. He thought about Cassidy Holt in a hospital in Pittsburgh. He thought about the 3 crossed-out names in the notebook and those families and the shape of the thing they were going to have to live with. And he thought about how the end of danger and the end of damage were not the same thing and never had been. He fell asleep sometime after midnight. He woke at 5:43 to the sound of his phone on the nightstand and the particular quality of early morning dark that meant the sun was still a long time away. He was awake in the complete way before he even looked at the screen. The army had done that to him, and it had never fully undone itself. He picked up the phone. It was Ellis. Not a text. A call. He answered it. "Ellis? Get up." Ellis's voice was stripped of everything but function. No preamble, no calibration, just the pure form of a man who needed to transmit a thing as fast as possible. "Get dressed. Don't wake Mila. Call Carol Marsh and get her to the house." Ryder was already standing. What happened? Voss had a partner. The cold floor under his feet, the dark room, the sleeping house. What? Not a buyer, not a client, a partner. Someone who helped him build the system, helped him move the information, helped him identify which families were isolated enough that complaints wouldn't get traction. Ellis's voice was controlled in the way a person controls something that wants to be uncontrolled. The FBI found the second name in his personal email archive, encrypted, but not encrypted well enough. Who? Ellis said the name. Ryder stood in his dark bedroom and heard the name, and the floor tilted very slightly, the way floors tilt when the world makes a small, irreversible adjustment to its geometry. The name was not a stranger. It was not someone from outside, someone institutional and distant like Voss. It was someone closer. It was someone whose name appeared in the ordinary daily texture of Ryder's life in Denton, attached to a face he had seen, a voice he had heard, a hand he might have shaken at a school event or a town meeting or any of the 100 ordinary intersections of small-town life where you accumulate names and faces without ever looking closely enough. He knows we're involved, Ellis said. The FBI's warrant included Raven's adjacent communication in the evidence summary. Gus's contact in Harlan County, the truck stop surveillance. His lawyer will have seen it by morning. If he hasn't already moved, he'll run, Ryder said. Or he won't run, Ellis said, and his voice was different now, lower, more precise, the voice he used when a system analysis had produced a result he didn't want. Or he won't run because running is evidence and he has another option. Ryder already knew what the other option was. He was already crossing the room to Mila's door, already pushing it open, already looking at the bed in the dark, the blanket, the pillow, the shape of his daughter sleeping. She was there. She was there, and she was asleep. And she was fine. He stood in the doorway and breathed through the terror that had spiked and was now settling. He knows where she goes to school, Ryder said. His voice was flat. He knows the morning drop time. He knows the east fence sight line and the camera positions. Yes. Because Voss gave him everything Voss had. Yes. The clock on the nightstand said 5:47 a.m. Drop-off time was 6:45, 58 minutes. I'm calling Carol, Ryder said. Already texted her your number, Ellis said. She's awake. I called her first. She said she'll be there in 10 minutes. Something in Ryder's chest did the thing it sometimes did with the Ravens. The loosening, the recognition of support that didn't announce itself, that was simply already in motion. He swallowed it down. There wasn't time for it right now. Where's Gus? On his way to you. Tommy's running the perimeter on Birch. School side. I'm watching the district admin building. You're watching? The second partner has an office there, Ellis said. Different department. He's not Voss. He doesn't have database access. What he has is a relationship, a 10-year professional relationship with Voss documented in the email archive. A pause. And he has a car, a silver car, different plates from Lester's rental, but the same make and model. Ryder stood in his bedroom doorway, phone to his ear, and looked at his sleeping daughter, and the silver car, and the east fence, and the name Ellis had said rearranged themselves into a picture he couldn't unsee. He was there, Ryder said. At the school, not Lester. We think so. We think Lester was the end user, and the second partner was the one doing the actual scouting. Lester didn't know Denton. He needed someone local to stand at the fence, Ryder said, to learn the pattern, to confirm the target. The word target in the same sentence as anything related to Mila was a thing he had to place carefully in a mental compartment and lock and come back to later, because if he opened it now in this hallway at 5:47 in the morning with 57 minutes until drop-off, nothing useful was going to happen. Ellis, he said. Yeah. If this man is still out there, if the FBI doesn't pick him up before 6:45, the FBI knows, Ellis said. Gus called it in 20 minutes ago. They're working the warrant. How long does a warrant take? Silence on the line. The kind of silence that was its own answer. Right, Ryder said. He went to the closet. He pulled on jeans, thermal, jacket, boots. He moved fast and quiet, the way you move in a house with a sleeping child. The military precision that becomes domestic precision, the same body doing the same thing in a different theater. Carol Marsh knocked on the front door at 5:54. He let her in, gave her the short version. Not all of it, not the Ellis version. Just, there may be a situation this morning. I need Mila here with you. Keep the doors locked. Carol Marsh was a retired school teacher who had seen a sufficient number of things in 67 years of living to hear a short version and understand that the full version existed and would be explained when there was time. She sat down on the couch with the particular settled quality of a woman who intended to stay precisely where she was put, and Ryder was grateful for her in the wordless way you are grateful for people who do not need everything explained. He went outside into the cold. Gus was in the driveway. He had parked the Harley at the edge of the lot and was standing beside it, leather cut over a thick thermal, breath fogging in the pre-dawn air, watching the road. He turned when Ryder came out. "You talked to Ellis." "I talked to Ellis." Gus looked at him in the dark. The full look, the inventory. "You're good. Mila's inside with Carol. I'm good." "The FBI has the name," Gus said. "Harlan County Contact is pushing it up the chain. They'll have a warrant." "When?" Gus didn't answer, which was the same answer Ellis had given with his silence. Ryder looked at the road. Route 9 was empty in the dark, the snow from the night before sitting white and still on the shoulders, the sky beginning to separate from black into the very first grade of gray that happens an hour before dawn. Somewhere across town, Tommy Wick was parked on Birch Avenue watching the east fence of Denton Elementary. Somewhere across town, Ellis Crane was watching the district admin building. Somewhere, and this was the weight that sat on everything else, a man whose name Ryder now knew was either in his house or in his car, or somewhere between one place and another, making a calculation about what his next move was. "If he runs," Ryder said, "he runs and the FBI picks him up within hours. The email archive is already in evidence. He's already finished. Running just makes it worse for him legally. And if he doesn't run," Gus was quiet for a moment, "then he does something stupid. He's already done something stupid. He's been doing it for years. Then he does something desperate." The word hung in the cold air between them. Ryder's phone buzzed. Tommy Wick, silver car, Birch and Fourth, parked, engine running. He showed the screen to Gus. Gus read it once, and his face did something it very rarely did. It lost the controlled quality entirely, just for a second, and underneath it was not anger, but something that looked like the memory of anger, old and familiar and still capable of heat. Ryder started walking toward the Harley. "Ryder!" Gus's voice. Not loud, not commanding, just the voice of a man who had been here before and knew the exact spot where this moment was standing. "The FBI is working a warrant." He turned and looked at Gus in the pre-dawn dark, in the cold, in the stillness of the empty road and the white fields. "Tommy is on Birch alone. The car has been running. It's 5:59 in the morning and Birch is empty and the school doesn't open for 45 minutes. And a man who knows exactly where my daughter's school fence is and what time we arrive is sitting in a running car 1 block away." Gus held his gaze. The moment between them was long and full of things that both of them understood. The lines that existed, the reasons for them, the cost of crossing them. The other cost, the one that lived in a dark room in Ryder's chest and had Dana's name on it and would also, if he let it, have Mila's name on it, would have it engraved there permanently and irreversibly if he stood in this driveway and waited for the correct institutional process to move at its correct institutional speed. Gus said, "We don't touch him. We don't touch him. We contain him. We make presents. We make sure he knows he's seen." Gus's eyes were direct and very clear. "The moment he moves, the moment his car moves, I call it in and we step back and let Patel's people take it." "Agreed." Gus looked at him one more second, then he swung onto the Harley. The engines caught in the cold morning air, Gus's first, then Ryder's, and the sound of them was what it always was, what it had always been, the sound that announced something without explaining it, the particular language of a thing that was both beautiful and serious. They rolled out of the driveway onto Route 9, and the headlights swept across the white fields and the frozen road, and somewhere a dog heard them, and somewhere a kitchen light came on, and somewhere the ordinary morning of Denton, Ohio was beginning its ordinary business without knowing what was running underneath it. 3 blocks from the school, Tommy's headlights blinked twice from the parking lot of a closed hardware store. Still there, still running. Ryder could see the silver car from here, sitting at the corner of Birch and Fourth, driver's side facing the school, facing the east fence, facing the place where the sidewalk ran along before cutting back toward the parking lot, the place where a man had stood 3 mornings in a row and learned a small girl's schedule and waved at her and used a name that wasn't hers. He brought the Harley to a stop at the intersection. The silver car was 30 yards away. He could see the shape of the driver behind the glass, still, watching, not yet aware that the morning had changed around him. The school fence was visible in the pre-dawn dark. The crossing guard Dennis wouldn't arrive for another 30 minutes. The building was dark except for the custodial entrance light. Ryder sat on the idling Harley and looked at the silver car, and felt the thing in him that was neither calm nor its opposite, but was the place where those two things had finally stopped fighting each other and made a different kind of peace. He had not protected Dana. He had walked into an interrogation room and told the truth to a man who had no reason to give him anything and come out with a child's location. He had stood in a parking lot at 3 in the morning in the freezing rain and waited for the right process to do the right thing. He was done waiting. He revved the engine once. Not hard, just enough. Just enough for the sound to travel 30 yards in the cold morning air and arrive through the driver's side window of a silver car, like a message in a language that didn't need translation. The driver's head turned, and Ryder Knox looked directly at the man who had helped build the system that had put Mila's name in a stranger's notebook, who had stood at this fence and learned the pattern and fed it outward. And he held the man's gaze across 30 yards of frozen Ohio Street in the last dark before dawn, and he did not move. And he did not look away. And behind him he could hear Gus's Harley and Tommy's Harley. And he knew without looking that they were flanking him, that the 3 of them were sitting in a line across the street in the dark and the cold with their engines running, and that the man in the silver car was doing the math of what he was looking at and arriving at the correct conclusion. The silver car's reverse lights came on, and Gus was already on the phone. But the car reversed fast, faster than Gus had anticipated, faster than the calculation had allowed for, swinging hard into a 3-point turn, tires slipping on the snow-packed street, and in the moment before it straightened and accelerated away from Birch Avenue, its headlights swept across the 3 Harleys and across Ryder's face, and for 1/2 second the man behind the wheel was fully illuminated, and Ryder saw his face clearly, and the face was frightened in the way that men are frightened when they have done something they cannot undo, and the accounting has finally arrived. And it was also, underneath the fear, something colder and more deliberate. The car was gone around the corner before the sentence finished itself. Gus said into the phone, "Suspect vehicle eastbound on 4th from Birch, silver sedan, partial plate." And he read the number Tommy had already sent to all of them, and somewhere across Denton the radio traffic was already moving, and Ryder was sitting on his idling Harley on Birch Avenue outside the dark school with the fence in front of him, and the cold coming in from the fields, and the first gray light of dawn, beginning to define the edges of things. And he understood, with the certainty of a man who has just seen a frightened man's cold eyes, that the flight was not panic. It was a plan, and the plan had a destination. His phone was ringing before he could reach for it. Carol Marsh. He answered it, and she said, in the voice she used when she was being completely calm because the alternative was not something she was going to allow herself. "Ryder, someone just tried the back." He was already moving before Carol finished the sentence. "Back door," she said. "Someone tried the back door. The handle moved. Mila's with me in the front room. She's fine. She doesn't—" "Don't open anything," Ryder said. "Don't go near any windows. Stay on the floor of the front room, away from the door." He was already turning the Harley. He could hear Gus behind him making the call to Patel. Suspect vehicle. Confirmed attempt at residential address. Knox property on Route 9. And the words were arriving at the correct place, but the correct place was still minutes away. And minutes was not a unit of time that meant anything useful right now. Route 9 was a straight shot. 1.5 miles. He opened the throttle, and the Harley responded with everything it had, the engine sound rising from a rumble to a sustained roar that split the pre-dawn quiet of Denton like something that had been held back too long. The cold hit his face through the visor, and he didn't feel it. He felt the road under the wheels and the distance closing and the specific gravity of a man moving toward the one thing that cannot be allowed to happen. Behind him, Gus, Tommy, 2 headlights in the dark, keeping pace. He came down Route 9 and turned hard into his own driveway, and the gravel sprayed under the rear tire. and he was off the bike before it had fully stopped moving, boots hitting the ground, the momentum carrying him forward toward the house in the same motion, and he saw it immediately. The back corner of the property, the gap in the fence line where the lot backed up against the field, a figure moving along the rear of the house in the gray pre-dawn, trying the back door handle again with a specific deliberate patience that was more frightening than panic would have been. The figure heard the Harley, turned. Ryder was already across the yard. The man was not large. That was the first thing. He was not large and he was not young, and he had the look of someone who had operated for years in the administrative dark, behind desks and in server rooms and through email chains, and who had not spent much time in situations that required a physical accounting. He had a crowbar in his right hand. Not a weapon exactly, a tool, something for the door. And when he saw Ryder coming across the yard at full speed in the dawn dark, he took 2 steps back and raised it. Ryder took the crowbar out of his hand. It was not complicated. It was not a fight in any cinematic sense. It was the simple mechanics of a man who had been trained to remove a threat from someone's hand and had done it enough times that the motion had no hesitation in it. One hand on the wrist, leverage, the crowbar hitting the frozen ground. The man went down to one knee, and Ryder had his arm, and he said, in the flat, controlled voice that was colder than shouting, "Don't." The man stopped moving. Gus was there in seconds. Tommy right behind him. Gus had his phone in one hand, and he was talking to Patel, and he was also watching the man on the ground, and the man on the ground was looking up at 3 bikers in the gray dawn in a backyard in Ohio, and understanding, perhaps for the first time in the years he had operated from a safe administrative distance, what it looked like when the people you had been moving pieces against were standing directly in front of you. "Name," Ryder said. The man's jaw was tight. His eyes were moving. To Ryder, to Gus, to Tommy, back to Ryder. Calculating. Still calculating even now, even on one knee in the frozen yard, the habit of a man who had spent years calculating angles. "We have your emails," Ryder said. "We have the payment records. We have Voss." He crouched down to eye level. His voice did not rise. "The calculation you're running right now has no good outcome. The only variable left is how much you say before the FBI gets here." The man said, "I want a lawyer." "You'll get one." Ryder stood up. After. Patel's cruiser was in the driveway 4 minutes later, 2 more behind it. Ryder stood in the yard and watched them put the man in cuffs and read him his rights in the cold morning air, and the man said nothing, kept the tight-jawed silence of someone who had decided that silence was his last available asset, and Ryder watched until the cruiser door closed and the lights pulled out of the driveway. Then he went inside. Carol Marsh was on the couch with Mila on her lap, Mila's library book open on the cushion beside them, which meant Carol had reached for something ordinary and handed it to the child, and Mila had accepted it the way she accepted things that adults offered in tense moments, graciously, without requiring them to be explained. She looked up when Ryder came through the door, and her eyes did the check, the inventory of him, the looking for damage. And he held out his hands so she could see them and said, "I'm good." She looked at his face. "You sure?" Sure enough. Carol stood carefully, the way Carol did everything, and said she was going to make coffee and not ask any questions until it was ready, which was the most useful thing anyone had said all morning. Mila sat on the couch and looked at Ryder with the dark eyes that saw too much. She said, "Was it the same man? From the fence?" "No, Bean. A different one." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the last of the cruisers was pulling away. The yard was empty. The dawn was coming up pale and flat over the frozen fields. "Are there more?" she asked. He sat down beside her. He thought about how to answer that, about the honest version and the useful version and whether they were the same thing this morning or not. He thought about what Gus had said about not opening chapters for 8-year-olds. He thought about Dana and about the things that were true that he hadn't said out loud, and the things that had calcified in the silence around them. "No more," he said. "It's done." She leaned against his arm. Just leaned. The full unconscious weight of a small person who has decided the threat is over and has chosen the nearest available anchor. He sat very still and let her lean. Outside the window, the Ohio sky was going from gray to the particular pale gold of a winter morning that has decided to be clear. And Gus was standing on the porch, one hand around a mug of Carol's coffee, watching the road in both directions out of habit, out of the permanent vigilance that becomes indistinguishable from personality after long enough. Ryder's phone buzzed. Patel. One line. Second subject in custody, both secure, FBI taking lead. You'll be contacted for statement. He read it. He read it again. He set the phone down on the couch cushion. Mila said, quietly, into the silence of the morning, "Dad." "Yeah. You came home fast." He looked at her. She was looking at the window, at the pale gold morning coming in, and her voice was the careful, precise voice she used when she was being exact about something that mattered. "I always come home," he said. She nodded, like she'd known. Like she'd always known and had just needed to hear it stated plainly in the specific grammar of this particular morning. Carol brought the coffee in, and the three of them sat in the front room while the morning came up fully over Denton, Ohio, and Gus came inside and Tommy came inside, and they stood with their mugs and nobody said much, because there are moments that don't need commentary, that only need the weight of several bodies in a warm room on the other side of something that could have gone differently. Ryder's coffee went cold. He didn't notice. He was looking at his daughter, who had fallen asleep against his arm in the thin winter sunlight, the library book open on the cushion beside her, one page turned to a photograph of Jupiter's moons. 92 of them, more than anyone had counted when the book was written, more than anyone had expected to find, turning quietly in the dark around something enormous. He pulled onto County Road 7 at 5:43 in the morning. The state patrol lights were already there, 2 units, blue and red cutting across the frozen ground in slow rotation, turning the frost on the grass into something that looked almost beautiful if you didn't know what it was marking. A third vehicle, unmarked, DCI. The SUV with no plates was boxed against the fence by a patrol cruiser. One man in flex cuffs sat on the running board of a unit with a deputy standing over him. The other man was already in a cage. Ryder cut his engine at the gate. Dutch pulled in beside him. The silence after the engines died was enormous. The particular silence of a place where something has just ended and the air hasn't settled yet. Felix was at the fence line, standing with his arms at his sides, his breath fogging in the cold. He looked at Ryder when he came through the gate and said nothing. He didn't need to. His face said everything about what the last 40 minutes had looked like from where he'd been standing. Webb came from the side of the house. He had blood on his left forearm. Not his, Ryder assessed immediately. The angle was wrong for his own injury. And his jacket was torn at the shoulder seam. He walked steadily. He stopped in front of Ryder. "Kids are out," Webb said. "All 7. DCI has them." A pause. The man who went inside, he wasn't just watching. He had transfer paperwork, blank forms, pre-signed by a board member. He was going to move 2 of them tonight, and nobody would have known where. Ryder stood in the cold and let that arrive completely. Blank forms, pre-signed. The infrastructure of disappearance, built and ready, waiting for the right moment to be used. "Miles," he said. Webb's jaw moved. "He's with a DCI family advocate. She's good with him. He won't let go of her hand." A pause. "He'll be okay. It'll take time. But he'll be okay." Ryder nodded once. He turned and looked at the house. The white Victorian with the green shutters that needed paint, the ground floor window that had been locked from the outside. And he stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and breathed the cold air through his nose until the thing in his chest found its level again. Colby appeared at his shoulder. "Harlan's in federal custody. Reeves just texted Marcus. Driscoll, too. Foss was picked up at his house 20 minutes ago." He paused. "Breckett, the DA contact. He's being interviewed. He lawyered up immediately, which tells you everything you need to know about what he knows." "And Garvey," Ryder said. "Federal agents are at his door." The rotation of the patrol lights moved across the frozen ground. Somewhere inside the house, a child made a sound. Not crying, just a child's voice, and then the lower register of the DCI advocate responding, and then quiet again. Ryder looked at the sky. The gray that had been building on the eastern horizon for the last 50 miles was now something more committed. A pale, cold light that wasn't quite dawn but was no longer pretending to be night. The mountains were beginning to separate from the dark. The valley was coming back. He was very tired. Not the sharp-edged exhaustion of crisis. That was burning off now, leaving behind the deeper kind, the kind that lived in the bones. His knee had stopped announcing itself and settled into a continuous low conversation he'd been having with it for years. His hands, when he took them from his pockets and looked at them, were steady. That was something. That had always been something. Dutch came and stood beside him. He didn't say anything. He took out his tobacco and rolled a cigarette with the patient, deliberate movements of a man who'd been doing it for 30 years. And he lit it, and he stood there smoking in the cold dawn light. And that was the entirety of what needed to happen between them right now. Sienna found Cassidy. Not that morning. That morning was consumed by statements, federal investigators, DCI interviews. The institutional machinery that arrives after the emergency has resolved and begins the long work of documenting it. But 2 days later, Sienna drove to the county facility and sat with Cassidy in the common room for 2 hours. She didn't tell Ryder much about what they talked about. She told him one thing, that Cassidy had sat across from her with her hands flat on the table and her chin level and her eyes clear, and that at some point in the conversation she had said, without drama, without performance, "I knew if I told someone the right person would do something. I just had to find the right person." Sienna had said, "How did you know we were the right people?" Cassidy had looked at her for a moment. Then, "Because you kept coming back. Every morning, even when there was nothing to see. People who are just passing through don't do that." Sienna told Ryder this sitting at the counter of the diner in Granite Falls on a Thursday morning, 9 days after County Road 7, with coffee in front of both of them and the winter light coming through the windows at a low angle that made everything look like it was being seen for the first time. She told it without commentary. She let it sit. Ryder held his cup in both hands and looked at the counter. "She's going to be all right," Sienna said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," he said. "She is." The federal investigation moved with the speed that cases move when the evidence is airtight and the agencies involved have their own reasons to want resolution. Davis Harlan was indicted on 14 federal counts. Gerald Foss cooperated in exchange for a reduced charge and provided documentation that expanded the indictment to include 3 additional defendants. Cole Driscoll's Clearwater Residential Services had its contracts terminated within 30 days. The network that had been operating under state licensing across 5 counties was dismantled facility by facility over the following 6 weeks. 43 children in Mineral County alone were reassessed and moved to verified placements. Across the 5-county area, the number was higher. The investigation into Carol Meredith's death was reopened by federal authorities. Garvey, faced with that specific file and what the forensic reanalysis of her vehicle suggested, chose to cooperate. His cooperation produced a name that went further up the chain than Harlan, a state-level official whose indictment, when it came, made the front page of 3 Montana papers and the national wire services. Ryder read about it in the diner on a Tuesday morning. He read it without particular satisfaction. Satisfaction was for things that ended cleanly. This didn't end cleanly. It ended the way real things ended, with residue and cost and the knowledge that it had taken 11 years and a dead reporter and 240 children and 1 small girl on a cold curb to get here. He folded the paper, drank his coffee, went back to the garage. Spring came to the valley in late April the way it always did. Not all at once, but in concessions. The frost gave up the south-facing ground first. Then the creek ran again, audible from the road. Then one morning the light had a different quality. Not warm yet, but less committed to cold. And the mountains showed their first differentiation of color, the dark green of the lower slopes coming back through the gray. The morning ride resumed its ordinary character. 7 bikes, sometimes 8. Route 9 north at 6:30. The particular necessary medicine of motion and engine sound and cold air and the company of people who understood without requiring explanation. On a Saturday morning in early May, they went to Missoula. Elena had made the arrangements. The family was a couple named Tron, late 30s, a small house near the university with a yard that had a garden that was just beginning to show green at the edges. They'd been on the matching list for 2 years. Sienna's contact had made the introduction. Avery had been with them for 6 weeks. They parked on the street, 14 bikes, lined along the curb the way they'd lined along Maple Street, on a January morning that felt like a different world. The neighborhood was quiet, residential, a Saturday morning just getting started. Somewhere a lawnmower ran briefly and stopped. Ryder got off his bike, took off his gloves, tucked them in his jacket pocket. The front door of the small house opened before he reached the walk. She'd grown, somehow, in 4 months. Or maybe it was just that she was standing differently, less contained. Her shoulders were lower. The practiced stillness she'd carried at Maple Creek was still there in the architecture of her, the way things that have been part of a person for a long time leave their shape even when they're no longer needed. But it wasn't the whole of her anymore. There was something else, something that hadn't been there before, or hadn't been visible. She stood on the front step and looked at the line of bikes and then at him. The bruise was long gone. Her face was just her face. She raised both hands, not the careful wrist-down wave from the curb. Both hands, open, level with her shoulders, fully raised, the way a person waves when they're not rationing the gesture. Every rider raised a hand back. All 14 of them lined along the curb, gloved hands going up in sequence, without coordination, without signal, just because it was what you did. Ryder walked up the front path. He stopped at the base of the steps, below her, same as always. He looked up at her. She looked at him with the dark, serious eyes that had been watching him from curtained windows and cold curbs since October. And in them was everything she still didn't have words for, and everything she was slowly, carefully, in the right house with the right people, beginning to learn she might not always need to hold alone. "Hey, kiddo," he said. She came down the steps and hugged him the same way she'd hugged him in the yard at Maple Creek, with her whole small self, arms around his midsection, face against his jacket. The grip of someone who had learned the difference between holding on because you're afraid and holding on because you're glad. He put his hand on the back of her head, stood still. Behind him, he could hear Dutch's boot on the sidewalk, unhurried. Elena saying something quiet to the woman at the door. Mrs. Tran, who was watching from the porch with the expression of someone who'd been told about the convoy and was seeing it for the first time and finding that the telling hadn't fully prepared her for the reality of 14 motorcycles on her street at 8 in the morning. After a moment, Avery pulled back. She looked up at him. She said carefully, with the weight of something she'd been working up to, "I knew you were going to come back." He looked at her. "Yeah." "Every morning," she said. "Even when I couldn't come outside. I could hear the engines." He was quiet for a moment. The morning light was on her face, the mild spring light of a valley coming back to itself, and the engines were quiet, and the street was quiet, and there was nothing in the air except coffee smell from somewhere open nearby, and the cold that was finally, genuinely beginning to lose. "We're not hard to find," he said. She almost smiled. "Close enough." He straightened, looked back at the line, at Dutch with his arms folded and his hat pulled down and that specific expression that wasn't softness, but was the thing adjacent to it that Dutch allowed himself in carefully selected moments. At Sienna, who was watching Avery with the focused stillness that was her version of everything she didn't say out loud. At Marcus, who was looking at the middle distance the way he did when he was filing something away as permanently significant. At Webb and Colby and Felix and Elena and the others lined along the curb in the spring morning light, none of them performing anything, all of them just present in the specific costly way that presence means something. No speeches, no ceremony. No version of this that required words to hold it together. Just the convoy and the curb and the small girl who had stood on the cold edge of a January morning and raised her hand, and the riders who had lifted theirs back, and everything that had followed from that single, stubborn, improbable act of acknowledgement. Ryder walked back to his bike, put on his gloves, settled his weight onto the seat. Dutch glanced at him. Ryder lifted his chin. Dutch reached down and started his engine, and then the next, and the sound built the way it always built, from one to something larger, from individual to something that had a shape and a direction and a reason. Avery stood on the front step and watched them go. Both hands raised, not waving now, just raised, open, the way you hold something you want to keep. Ryder looked at her in his mirror until the road curved and she was gone. The convoy rode north on a May morning in Montana, through a valley where the frost had finally let go of the ground, where the creek was running and the mountains were coming back into their colors, and the light was doing what light does when the season turns, falling differently, landing softer, asking less of the things it touched. The engines ran steady and low, and the road opened ahead of them, and nobody needed to say where they were going because they all knew, north on Route 9, the same road they always rode, the one that had brought them past a cold curb on a January morning and set everything in motion. The same road, a different world. And somewhere behind them, on a front step on a residential street in Missoula, a girl who had learned to wave carefully stood with both arms raised and watched the sound fade into the spring morning until there was nothing left of it but the memory of it and the knowledge. The new, careful, enormously costly knowledge. That memory was something she was allowed to keep, that she was seen, that she was held, that the convoy always came back,